Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right into a recent and, let me tell you, highly charged Sky News Australia broadcast. We're going to neutrally unpack its core arguments around the economy, immigration, and cultural identity. If you've been following Australian politics at all, you know these topics are absolute lightning rods right now. Our goal here isn't to pick a side, but rather to break down exactly what this conservative panel is arguing, how they connect these incredibly complex issues, and the rhetorical strategies they use to make their case.
Let's start with the broadcast's central thesis, which is honestly quite stark. We are now nothing more than an economy. The commentators, kind of echoing sentiments from folks like Tony Abbott, claim the current government is prioritising sheer population numbers over domestic prosperity and traditional Australian values. Basically, they're arguing that the cultural identity of the nation is being stripped away, replaced by this relentless transactional focus on raw economic output and GDP.
To make sense of it all, we're going to look at 5 main themes today: the per capita economy, housing and immigration claims, citizenship as electoral strategy, climate institutions and debt, and finally, the burqa and assimilation.
Okay, Section 1, the per capita economy, individual wealth.
So, a really critical distinction is made here. The commentators actually concede that Australia's overall economy is growing, but they argue this growth is completely driven by high immigration rates. If you look at per capita growth, which is just the economic output divided by the population, they argue that individual prosperity is actually shrinking. In their view, that top-line GDP growth is essentially a mirage that's masking a real decline in individual finances.
To illustrate this point, the panel points back to the 70s and 80s, the Fraser, Hawke, Keating, and Howard years, as this sort of golden era of wealth creation where per capita growth soared. On the flip side, they dismiss the middle eras as having low or mixed growth, and they fiercely criticize the current Labour government. They literally refer to the Albanese era's data point as a miserable red worm, explicitly labeling their economic record as an absolutely pathetic destruction of Australian prosperity and future opportunity.
And to really drive this economic argument home, the panel uses some intense rhetorical highlighting. They compare the government to a complete 2 bowls of bourbon a day drunk. It's a heavy metaphor. They picture a severe alcoholic, someone terrified they might start seeing bats and shaking if they quit, to criticize what they see as the government's dangerous dependency on high immigration rates just to keep the economy afloat.
Moving right along to Section 2, Housing and Immigration, Living Standards.
This broad economic claim connects directly to the concept of negative equity. The panel argues that government policies, specifically pushing a 5% deposit scheme for home loans while simultaneously dealing with tax hikes and an induced housing crisis, have led to a totally catastrophic situation. They call this economic vandalism, claiming it traps recent homebuyers in a devastating spot where they actually owe the bank more than their home is worth.
To emphasize this perceived failure, the commentators repeatedly describe the strategy as simply just about getting bodies in, keeping the Ponzi scheme working. That's their phrase, a Ponzi scheme. Their argument asserts that this artificially inflated system is actively lowering living standards across the board. And they say it's impacting everyone, from struggling socioeconomic groups all the way up to upper-income bands who are feeling the pinch too.
Which brings us to Section 3, Citizenship as Electoral Strategy, Citizenship and Voting.
Here, the commentators cite a report from the Daily Telegraph to argue that the federal government is cynically fast-tracking citizenship ceremonies. They claim local councils, particularly out in Western Sydney, are being aggressively pushed to clear out their waiting lists to mint new voters right before the next federal election. So the core accusation here is that this is a deliberate tactic to turn marginal electorates by naturalising thousands of migrants, all to lock in a permanent electoral advantage for the Labor Party.
The whole crux of this political theory rests on one specific figure, 80%. The panel cites a Labour pollster's claim that roughly 80% of Indian migrants, a massive and rapidly growing demographic that they note will soon be the largest, vote for the Labour Party. So they argue that this sheer volume of highly targeted, newly naturalized citizens voting as a bloc could completely turn future elections. In their eyes, this effectively destroys the Conservative opposition's chances.
Next up, Section 4, Climate Institutions and Debt, One Nation's Agenda.
The broadcast then favorably outlines a proposed economic solution championed by the right-wing party, One Nation. This approach is laid out in 3 pretty drastic steps. Step 1, completely abolish all climate change institutions and authorities. Step 2, use that move to free up billions of dollars in taxpayer money that is currently funding what the panel dismisses as boondoggles. And Step 3,
redirect those massive funds entirely toward reducing the national debt, which they argue should be the true priority.
Furthermore, the panel takes sharp aim at the current political establishment, and interestingly, they notably include the Conservative coalition in this critique. They slam them for treating climate change as an untouchable issue. They claim the coalition is just too timid because it refuses to pull out of the Paris Accord. To make their point, they actually point to New Zealand as a benchmark, claiming New Zealand has pulled out. What you should really take away from this is how the panel uses these claims to pressure domestic politicians, basically demanding they abandon climate commitments for a much harder conservative line.
And finally, Section 5, the burqa and assimilation, cultural identity. Here, the host uses some highly evocative and controversial comparisons to argue against the burqa. They describe it as a form of reverse assimilation that forces a vulnerable group to not look like the mainstream. They even make the incredibly jarring comparison that it is every bit as segregationist as putting Rosa Parks at the back of the bus. The panel frames the burqa purely as a tool of gender apartheid and oppression, asserting that banning it isn't even controversial, but rather a completely necessary step for integrating communities under a single Australian culture.
However, what's really fascinating here is a moment of nuanced disagreement within the panel itself. One panelist actually cautions against grafting European problems, like the ones we see in Britain and France, onto Australia. They point out that while Europe is dealing with issues stemming from illegal, refugee-based, and Islamist migration, Australia's context is vastly different. Australia's core debate, they argue, is actually about the size and scale of a strictly legal immigration system. They suggest the burqa debate might just be importing a culture war that doesn't perfectly fit the Australian reality.
But, the panel ultimately circles back. They conclude this segment by framing the burqa as a profound symbol of broader national control. They argue that if the political class is too timid to easily eliminate what the panel views as a minor, symbolic issue, well, then they are entirely incapable of controlling the larger, far more consequential issues facing the country. It essentially becomes a litmus test for political strength and authority.
By synthesizing this narrative and breaking it down into these 5 themes, we can really clearly see the underlying architecture of their argument. The panel successfully weaves together distinct, everyday grievances about housing costs and negative equity, demographic fears about voting patterns, and potent cultural symbols into a single, unified populist narrative. They are building a comprehensive case against the political establishment, arguing it has completely failed the everyday Australian on every conceivable front.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to ponder. When complex economic and demographic challenges are consistently framed with such intense metaphorical language, comparing governments to severe drug addicts or immigration to Ponzi schemes, how does that ultimately impact the health and objectivity of our democratic discourse? Does it clarify the issues for everyday citizens, or does it make finding actual workable solutions that much harder? Food for thought.